The following program is brought to you by coronavirus and the newest in the beta coronavirus line, COVID-19. Coronavirus, bringing human misery for 8,000 years. And by the state of Wisconsin's prohibition on gatherings of more than 10 people. Wisconsin, forward. And by the faculty and staff of Lawrence University.
Hi, welcome to Historic Preservation Lecture 10. We're going to talk about politics and really how all politics, when it comes down to it, are local. We've been talking about Section 106. We've been talking about the federal agencies and the laws that govern historic preservation, but this relatively brief lecture is really on bringing it down to the local level because in the end, basically all politics are local. So let's start talking about some of the important local players. And one of the most important we've talked about at length are the SHPOs and the TIPOs, the State Historic Preservation Officers. These are the people who are really in charge of making sure historic preservation gets done in the state. And without a strong SHPO or TIPO, very little is actually going to get done. So while the federal government does have historic preservation laws and is in charge of those, it really is the SHPOs or the TIPOs who put that into practice in their states and who are in charge of overseeing that at the local level. So in the end, it is the SHPOs who are really in charge of historic preservation in the United States. Municipal governments play a huge role in historic preservation because those municipal governments are the ones that set the municipal codes on things like building and zoning and property aspects, and all of that really plays into historic preservation and the ability for property owners and businesses and others to accomplish historic preservation goals. I'll just give you one example from here in Appleton. Older houses tended to be built closer to the street. So in the neighborhood I live in, most of the houses are relatively close to the street and have very large backyards. Part of the reason for that is that people had larger gardens at the time, but also because a lot of summer activities were done outside, because it would actually be cooler, and because if you were using horses, you needed some area for them other than your garage. Your garage was essentially a barn. So yards bigger in the back, closer to the street. In Appleton right now, you have to have a 20-foot boundary by code between the sidewalk and your house. Well, between the sidewalk and many older houses, there's far less than 20 feet. Maybe there's only 10 feet between the porch and the sidewalk. If the city didn't give preservation grandfather clause, allow older houses, those built before, I think, 1900, to be able to have a closer setback, a lot of those houses couldn't be remodeled, and essentially they might even have to be torn down if anyone wanted to change them significantly. So the local municipal code really provides the opportunity for older houses to remain in the housing stock. Otherwise, they would violate code and they'd have to be moved or torn down. It's part of that also because the ones who are sort of putting the historic preservation code aspects into practice and interpreting them and applying them, municipal commissions are really key. And these come down to neighbors, to citizens, to people who aren't elected. They're brought in as players in the community to be on public works commissions that are governing the streets, the parks, the sewer systems, all those things. Planning commissions that are setting the priorities for what the local community is going to do in terms of developing downtown, developing neighborhoods, parks, all of those things, and zoning commissions that determine how properties can be used in the community. And again, these are not made up of elected officials. These are people who have been appointed by the city council or by the mayor or by whoever the officer is, the corporate president or whomever it is that is running the township or the city, village, or the city. In Wisconsin, we have those three: township, villages, and cities. And those members of the commissions, those appointed members, really end up making all of the decisions about properties, about plans for using areas of the community, about development ideas. All of the things that affect historic preservation really come down to essentially the citizens in the community serving on these commissions. And finally, these people are strongly affected by local historical and environmental groups because their neighbors are the people who are in these groups, and they talk to and persuade the members of these commissions to follow practices that support their interests in historical or environmental issues. So when it gets right down to it, these local people, the citizens of the community, are really the ones who are either implementing strong historic preservation ideas, laws, codes, or the ones who are not implementing them. So it is these local people that really are at the core of historic preservation, just like we've talked about volunteers are at the core of historic preservation. It really comes down to the local community. Oh, I forgot, of course, property owners. Property owners have a lot of effect on commissions. If a property owner comes in and is really upset about some zoning thing, the commission might provide the opportunity to get a waiver of that zoning issue, or public works, planning, whatever. Really, the property owners that have a lot of power in this system because these are people they work with, go to church with, play golf with, whatever. So, again, local is everything. The other way that politics become local is through the process of consultation, because we know that any Section 106 activity has to include, and in fact focuses on, consultation with all potential stakeholders. And those potential stakeholders are much broader than you might consider just thinking about it. It's not just the property owners and the person doing the undertaking. There's a lot of other people who are involved. So those include, of course, neighbors and neighborhood groups. And these people can become a very powerful force either for ensuring historic preservation or fighting against it, and especially neighborhood groups. And there are strong neighborhood groups in many communities that want to maintain the character of their neighborhoods, and so are very strong and political about zoning issues and about property issues and about things in the building code that maintain the character of their neighborhoods. There are also businesses. Local businesses have a lot at stake in terms of planning and in terms of how historic preservation might be done. Some might want to have a new shopping mall to get better facilities and lower costs. Some might want to keep a historic downtown because that is attractive to people coming in and shopping. So they have interests that are in the business that is very important. Community nonprofits have a major role in a lot of historic preservation. Nonprofits deal with things like maintaining downtowns. There are downtown associations and business associations that work on behalf of the neighborhoods and the businesses and the residents of various areas in a community. There are community grant organizations. A lot of communities have what are called community foundations that provide funds for all kinds of activities for the good of the community, and one of those is historic preservation. They can have a major role in obtaining funding for historic preservation activities, and that can change the consideration by the other political players, the commission members and others. If there's funding for some activity, it makes it much more attractive. Other community nonprofits are things like for low-cost housing, and some of those organizations will get together so that they can convert a relatively inexpensive building, maybe one that is considered a blight and can be purchased for $1 or something from the city, in order to turn that into low rent or supported housing, rent supported housing, rent controlled housing for individuals in the community, or to other things, into a community center or things like that. So nonprofits play a major role. One of the things you might think about is that there's a lot of people who are in political action groups, like property rights groups, who oppose control of property rights oppose the intrusion upon property rights by local government. And those property rights groups are against tax breaks, are against raising funds for improvement of particular areas, are against tax breaks or funding for low rent or rent controlled housing, all kinds of things. So those, what we might call right-wing groups, actually play a major role in local politics, as do, or what we could call civil rights groups, who would fight for rent-controlled housing, fight for sustainability of a neighborhood, fight for economic equality in housing. And so we might call those more left-wing groups, also play a major role in local politics. So these are all people who in the Section 106 process would need to be consulted and would have input. When you look at this then, the Section 106 process and the whole process of historic preservation really becomes extremely local. It comes down to the neighborhood and to the groups that are working in the neighborhood. Okay, a lot of information to take in quickly. Let's have a short break. And now, music. And we are back. So let's move on to enforcement. With historic preservation law, we have to have someone to enforce those laws or they're meaningless. So who actually enforces the historic preservation laws? Well, the primary group that enforces historic preservation laws are local building inspectors. They're the ones who are on the ground out there making sure that historic preservation regulations are being followed or not being followed. And so if someone, for example, is supposed to be using historically appropriate materials and they're not, it's the local building inspector who is going to be finding that. And one of the problems is local building inspectors are not always focused on those aspects. They're concerned with safety more than appearance. And it really is only if, for example, a historic preservation commission or a historic organization recognizes something that's not being done properly. Someone's getting a tax break and they're supposed to be doing something and they're not. that the local building inspector would be called in, would be asked to come in and look at something. Now, having said that, in the plans, all of that stuff should be laid out, and the inspectors should have approved the plans and then be looking to make sure that the plans are being followed. But as I said, the building inspectors often have a lot of stuff to do. They're under a lot of pressure to get through their inspection so that construction can go on, and they're really concerned about public safety. And so some of the sort of historic preservation aspects might not get seen. So they're really the ones who have to enforce. And they have so much to enforce that sometimes those historic preservation things are put in the back burner. And if we look at who's in control then of making sure historic preservation activities are done right, it comes down in part to very local building inspectors and others who may not have that as a focus of their work. Above them, then, the SHPO, and in permitting cases, the Corps of Engineers, compliance staff, are the ones who have to really make sure things are being done, and done properly. But again, the SHPO, Corps of Engineers, has staff that are under a lot of pressure to get a lot of stuff done. The compliance officer at the Wisconsin SHPO is one person. They have one compliance officer to look at the entire state. And they do an excellent job of doing that. But do they miss things? Probably. And do they have to rely on local governments and local building inspectors a lot? Yeah. So enforcement is not tightly controlled for historic preservation law. If a local person sees something, or a local organization sees something that they don't like, that they think is being done wrong, that is violating historic preservation law, they can go to the local building inspector. And one hopes that the building inspector or the city, the planning commission or the public works commission or whomever is overseeing the building inspectors, the building department, will step in and make sure that things are done properly. But sometimes they don't. They're overworked also. There can be an appeal to the SHPO, or notification of the SHPO or the Corps of Engineers compliance staff, and one hopes they would step in. If neither of those are able to satisfy a historic preservation concern, citizens or groups can go to the state attorney general to try and get an injunction. The state attorney general is concerned with lots of things of state importance, and again, a historic preservation issue locally may not take on a lot of importance for the attorney general's office, and they may ignore it because they have bigger fish to fry. On federal, like Corps of Engineer projects, the Justice Department might be consulted, but again, that can be pretty tough. They have major crimes to deal with, and local historic preservation issues are going to get pushed back. Having said that, an appeal to the state's attorney is going to get the attention of the SHPO, who's going to bring that to the local building inspectors. But what I want to point out in all of this is that enforcement of these historic preservation laws is an ongoing challenge. So while we have the laws, a lot of it comes down in terms of enforcement, again, to the local community, to that building inspector and the Public Works Commission or whomever who is kind of overseeing building inspections, or the Historic Preservation Commission who's making sure the inspectors are looking at that thing. All of this is, again, coming down to this idea, all politics are local, and even in terms of enforcement. Okay, we get off of that law part and that these requirements of what you have to do. And now we shift to what you want to do. And That has to do with community planning, which again is local. Communities have a planning department that does zoning, makes sure that buildings are being built the proper way. They oversee that whole, when a community is changing, they oversee the change and make sure the changes are going on in terms of roads and parks and buildings and all that stuff, that's being done correctly and according to a plan. That plan is called the comprehensive plan. And virtually all communities have some form of a comprehensive plan that guides change in the community. It guides how roads are built or roads are closed, how utilities are put in or how utilities are shut down, how building is done, how demolition is done. All of those things about a community are based in a comprehensive plan for growth, for decline, for change. And within that comprehensive plan, there should be, although there isn't always, some aspect of historic preservation. There usually is something about cultural resources in a community and environmental resources in a community and how those can be maintained and used for the benefit of the community. But that often doesn't get really to historic preservation per se or historic preservation planning in the sense of identifying important historic properties that need to be preserved or that can be incorporated into a plan for, let's say, developing the downtown area or developing a neighborhood, bringing the property values up and revitalizing a neighborhood or something like that, or maintaining a neighborhood so that the houses aren't being torn down and new ones built. Those might be part of a comprehensive plan, but often they're only a minor piece, and the focus really ends up on being new construction and expansion of a community rather than revitalizing particular parts. In larger communities that's a part, but in a lot of places it's not. And that's really where historic preservation should come in. Unfortunately, it doesn't. That gets back to, again, what I'm emphasizing in this lecture, which is how all of this is local, because the comprehensive plan is local. It comes out of the Planning Commission and the Zoning Commission and the Public Works Department and the council ultimately coming together and creating this plan for their vision of the community 10, 20 years down the road. In most places, there is also a regional plan, which brings a group of community comprehensive plans together to look at an entire region and how it might look 10, 20 years down the road, thinking about community expansion, where businesses should be located, natural areas that should be preserved, and one hopes cultural and historic sites and communities that should be maintained or should be enhanced for the growth of the community and of the region. As part of those regional plans, a really important element that is not always there is what's called heritage tourism. I'm calling it that, but the importance of heritage as part of a region and a community. And today, heritage tourism is a very important growing concern for a lot of communities and businesses. And in particular, providing unique shopping and dining experiences in communities. And that also is in terms of living experiences, hotels, but also apartments. That there is a desire today to not go into a metal and glass and steel building, but to have some kind of unique place to shop. Small shops are in many towns being put forward rather than the mall. And in Appleton here, we have actually a pretty good balance that's been created between the big box stores and the smaller stores that are staying in downtowns. Some of the communities in the Fox cities have to grow that, but one of the things they're focusing on is those unique local places that are in downtowns that are historic structures that have the beautiful facades, the fancy interiors with wood and tin ceilings and ceiling fans and those kinds of things that provide a really unique shopping experience or dining experience. And in community, comprehensive, and regional plans, those are more and more being emphasized, and that's really good for historic preservation. The other thing are that historic places are becoming more and more popular as places to visit, especially if they're combined with really unique shopping and dining opportunities. And unique historic places, often if they're combined with unique shopping and dining, become really important and great attractions. In Door County, we have some of those kinds of communities. Ephraim, for example, where you have unique shopping and dining places, some of them old, some of them new, and historic places, with especially lighthouses. Lighthouses are very attractive historic places for tourists. But, for example, there's converted barns, there's old storefronts, there's shops that have been around for generations that provide that historical perspective that creates memories. This is what we did when I was a kid. This is how it looked when Grandpa lived here and they went to the same place. I have a summer home in Michigan, and there's a place nearby in a town called Leland that is called Fishtown. And it is an old fish pier. The Great Lakes fishing boats used to come in and unload their fish. It's been converted into a absolutely unique shopping area where all these little old fish shacks have been turned into little stores. There isn't really dining there, but there's dining nearby. It is a historic place, but it is one of the most popular tourist destinations because it gives that sort of unique experience that you wouldn't get anywhere else, because this is a unique historic spot. So, in regional plans and comprehensive plans, more and more these ideas of these unique historic places are being incorporated. And as we've talked about before, that becomes the core of historic preservation. We're going to get into this more next week, but historic preservation will only be successful if the local community buys into it, and the main way that they buy into it is if there are economic benefits for the community. If historic preservation starts costing money and not providing anything other than nice-looking buildings, if it's not done as part of a plan with local community input, local community enforcement, it's not going to happen. And when it happens properly, it is enforced, it's part of a plan, and what it typically does is provide cultural, community, and economic benefits. So, that's what we're going to move into in the next week. Again, I said this was a short lecture, a lot of meat in it though, and I hope you got the key point, which is when it comes right down to it, historic preservation gets done at the local community. Okay, we'll see you later.
Oh, hi. I just started reading the preservation planning chapter in historic preservation. And just right here at the start, there's a very interesting phrase I'd like to read to you. Planners are not adverse to preservation any more than preservationists are against development. Both are against bad development. They oppose development that is insensitive to the existing context of a community and its significant resources and heritage. But they favor development that blends new and old in a compatible way that strengthens both. I like the way that your book puts that. I think it is one of the key aspects of historic preservation, and yet from what the book says, you can see it's one of the most difficult things. To be able to blend the old and the new in compatible ways, to be able to oppose development that is insensitive and promote development that is sensitive to the context of the historic community, it's very hard to do. I'd like you to give some thought to that. How does one bridge the old and the new? How does one promote sensitive development, or development that is sensitive to the old while being sensitive to the new? It's a very interesting question.